Hi, everybody. My name is Penny Overton. I write about cannabis and lobsters for the Portland Press Herald. I'm going to introduce the panelists, and here we go. Erik Gundersen is the director of the newly created Maine Office of Marijuana Policy. New is in like a year. Appointed in 2019, the Bangor native oversees the office responsible for all aspects of licensing, regulation, and oversight of the state's medical and adult use marijuana programs. Before his appointment, he served as policy advisor to Speaker of the House Sarah Gideon. The University of Maine graduate now lives in Portland with his wife and daughter. Shawn Collins is the executive director of the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission. Appointed in 2017, the Webster native has overseen the 2018 rollout of the Massachusetts adult use market, which is nearing the $1 billion sales milestone, and the state's 8-year-old medical market as well. He previously served as assistant treasurer and policy and legislative affairs director to the state treasurer, and he's a graduate of Suffolk University Law School. Cindy Franklin served as director of Alaska's Marijuana Regulatory Agency from 2014 through 2017. She oversaw the rollout of the adult use market there from a narrowly approved legalization ballot measure in 2014 through the opening of the state's first retail stores in 2016. The former prosecutor is now in private practice in Anchorage, representing marijuana industry clients. She's a Texas native and graduate of Baylor Law School. I'd like to thank all the panelists for joining us here tonight. Just a word to start off, I wanted to let you know why these panelists are here with us tonight. The thought was on Friday, when we launch recreational sales here in Maine, it might help us to take a look and see what other states have done before us. Alaska is about our market size, has a lot in common with Maine's marijuana market, and has seen a few more years under their belt than we have. And then we also look to Massachusetts as the New England state that legalized at the same time we did, but got across the finish line a year earlier, more than a year actually. So that's why these two panelists are here with us, to kind of give us the benefit of their experience and what they've seen there and how we might be able to learn from that. So with that in mind, first, why don't we talk about the road to legalization and find out from our panelists, how long did it take to get from legalization to first sale in their states, and what were some of the biggest challenges they faced? Whoever wants to jump in.
Well, Penny, I'll start since we were sort of the longest to go, I think. We had our ballot measure on November 4th of 2014, and but it was not effective until February of 2015. So the first thing that we encountered was a lot of misunderstanding about what people could and couldn't do as of November, and then as of February, when the law actually took effect. We had a very narrow time frame in the ballot measure to write 9 articles of regulation. We were standing up all of the industry, all 4 license types, from nothing. We had no medical market, we had no legal dispensaries, we had nothing that any of the other states that had legalized for adult use had. But we did have a lot of help from our fellow regulators. We went to Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and spent really a crash course, about 60 days between February and May, learning about some of the issues. And then we just began working on the articles of regulation. We had to get legislation passed in our legislature. Luckily, they meet from January to May normally, so we were able to get some things through that we needed to get going. And we really needed to have all the articles of regulation written by November of 2015, and we made that deadline. It was highly controversial. All of the regulations went out for public comment multiple times. They had to be reviewed by our Attorney General's office, and there were a lot of procedural and, if you will, bureaucratic steps that were very hard for the public to understand. But once the public understood that they were going to be able to be engaged in the regulatory process, they really stepped forward. And we got a lot of comments, we got a lot of coverage in the press. And so by the time the regulations were passed, I think Alaskans had a good understanding that as a government, we had responded to the ballot measure and had gotten those articles written in what was essentially record time. Behind the scenes, we were facing a lot of other obstacles, trying to get something like metrics set up. Of course, when you're in state government, you have to do RFPs. You don't just get to pick someone. And so there were a lot of moving parts and pieces. And our staff, what I would tell people at the time was a good day in our office was a day when nobody cried. We had a very small staff. It was a ton of pressure. And most of the individuals that were there at that time during those 2 years have left, frankly, because it was just so intense. But we did get stores open October 29th, 2016. And I think it must be a little different than what we're going to hear from the other states, because our stores opened one at a time. The first store that opened in Alaska opened October 29th, 2016 in Valdez, which is a tiny town. Most people know it from its oil spill. And there were 45 people in that line waiting to get into the store by the time they opened their doors. And some other stores rolled out shortly after that in Fairbanks and Anchorage, which are a couple of our largest cities. And each store was opening as they got their individual approvals from our staff. So there was no day where everybody opened at once. But we did it in less than 2 years from the day that Alaskans were at the ballot box. And we're very proud of that because it was a big lift.
Shawn, what about you?
Yeah, let me build off that. The timeline was actually pretty similar. We've had medical in Massachusetts since 2012. It was also adopted through a ballot question. In November of 2016, we had a ballot question in Massachusetts that passed by the will of the voters. So our legislature took an opportunity, though, to chime in and make some edits and put their fingerprint on our ultimate final legislation, which passed in July of 2017. So November 2016 to July of 2017, our legislature really dug in and reacted to the ballot question and made some pretty significant amendments. One of the amendments was actually taking the oversight entity, the Cannabis Control Commission, which exists today, and pulling it out of the Treasurer's office and making it a totally independent state agency. Those 5 commissioners, which ultimately govern adult use and now medical cannabis in Massachusetts, are appointed by the Attorney General, the State Treasurer, and the Governor in some combination thereof. They began their terms on September 1st of 2017. Their first order of business was to find and build the staff. So they started by hiring an executive director, which is a job that I hold and have held since October of 2017. And a lot like Cindy, we've been hard at work since. We really dug in and began to build something, which included developing regulations. One of the things that I think we're also doing, which is unique, is we're starting an agency from scratch. We had no HR, no IT, no legal, and also no phone number, no desks, no computers, nothing. So we had to build it and then also develop a regulatory scheme for a brand new industry, which was a challenge. We, in building it, developed an application process, developed our license types. We got our first draft of regulations done by December of 2017, which then allowed us to finalize our regulations by March of 2018, begin accepting applications by April of 2018, and then ultimately we began licensing folks in around June and opened our first stores. There were 2 of them, one in Leicester, one in Pittsfield, so Central Mass and Western Mass, November of 2018. So all in, it was about a 2-year period, but I would really look at that timeline and say that it was September 2017 when someone actually started working on regulations to November of 2018 when we actually opened up our first stores. We licensed a fully regulated, or we opened up a fully regulated marketplace. We had cultivation, product manufacturing, lab testing, metric fully functional, and then retail sales down to the first, at the first sale. There was nothing left to do. And I think that's one of the things that we're really proud of was everything was functioning. It wasn't a, we'll do this until such time. It was everything was rolled out. So a lot to be proud of, but again, if you're someone that's been working on legalization from an advocacy standpoint, you look at that timeline and say, what's taking you so long? But we have the receipts to show for it. We put a lot of work in.
All right, Erik, that brings us to the 4-year.
Yeah, right.
So help Mainers understand why it took 4 years from the ballot measure passing to first sales. And I don't think COVID's going to cover all of it. So walk us through the other stuff.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is probably the question that I have the most practice at answering, because everybody says 4 years, what's taken so long? And they point to Shawn in Massachusetts, which weren't helpful in their turnaround time. But yeah, it's really a two-part story, right? So in Maine, we also passed it at the ballot box in 2016, the same time in Massachusetts. However, early on, the underlying language of what got passed at the ballot box had some significant issues to it, and those red flags went up early. And then I'm sure a lot of people know the story of the legislature putting together the Marijuana Legalization Implementation Committee to really go to work and rewrite that document from start to finish. There were 2 legislative rewrites, 2 governor's vetoes, but at the end of the day, in the middle of 2018, the legislature overrode the governor's veto in LD 1719, which really set the foundation of our legal market into motion. So then fast forward to 2019, February 2019, the new administration, the Mills administration comes in, and that's when they actually created my office, the Office of Marijuana Policy. And it was literally just me sitting by myself in a state office building, thinking to myself, what the heck am I supposed to do now? So much like Shawn, new agency, no staff, no real office. So we had to get to work fairly quickly, not only scaling up the staff and all of that, but we were under a tight timeline for the first action that we needed to take was to put the regulations together, really what the framework now is going to look like for when we roll out these retail sales. So I like to think that it starts from February 2019, because when we were established, we were starting from scratch, really nothing. And since then, pretty much every single goal that we set for ourselves and made public, we hit. And again, going back to the regulations, we need to get them in front of the legislature before they went home because they're part-time. And in the matter of, I think, 6 weeks, we had drafted 80 pages of regulations. We had gotten input from, I think, like 8 different state agencies, stakeholders from all ends of the spectrum. And at the end of the day, the legislature signed off on them, and the governor signed it, and they went into effect in fall of 2019. During that time, obviously, we have to build and operationalize those regulations, scaling up the office, bringing on staff, putting together your licensing regime, your compliance regime, implementing your systems, our licensing system, our inventory tracking system. My favorite piece, I'm sure we'll talk about later tonight, is our data lake and our data warehouse for different types of public health and public safety efforts that are underway. And then after we got the regulations passed and we started scaling up, the next objective and goal we put forward was, well, now that these are in place, we're going to start accepting applications by the end of 2019, which, again, we successfully did. And once we got that process going, the next thing that we turned to was, all right, spring 2020, we're going to launch. And then obviously early on in April, it became obvious that just a launch wasn't realistic with the unfolding global health pandemic. So at that point, well, unfortunate, it was obviously the smart move to basically indefinitely postpone the launch. COVID presented a number of barriers and challenges. First and foremost, it delayed us bringing on a testing facility, which we had been public about up to that point. We were not going to start the system until we had that testing lab in place. So the town votes that were in place to bring that lab on were delayed. The second step of our licensing process is our local authorization, what we call our local authorization, where the applicants need to go find a host municipality and go through their licensing regime. Towns were closed, short-staffed, really not a priority for them. They weren't coming back nearly at the capacity we needed to start the system. And then the most obvious one was the public health aspect. How can we safely launch? So we cleared all those barriers. We worked through them. And then we got to a place where we were comfortable, where we announced last month, basically the start of the system. And here we are. So Yeah, it took 4 years, but I like to think we did it a little bit quicker.
So that actually brings me to the idea of what opening days actually look like. What was the scene like? Paint us kind of a brief picture of what opening day was like in Massachusetts. I think, Cindy, you talked a little bit about people making the trek up to Valdez, right? But talk to us a little bit about whether there were product shortages, track and trace issues, like what are the glitches that we need to be watching out for come opening day, and what was the scene like?
Well, I see.
No, fine.
Yeah, I'll just say real quick, that scene in Valdez was very fun, 45 people, but we almost immediately had other stores open with much longer lines. We did run into some product shortages about 2 or 3 months in, but they were short-lived, and it was simply a function of cultivation facilities catching up with the first crops being sold out. And once we got past that and everyone got a rhythm, we really have not had much product shortages. So it was very smooth. Metric worked, everything worked as it should have, and everybody was pretty happy about it.
Yeah, really largely the same in Massachusetts. As I mentioned, there were 2 locations that opened on the same day, one in Western Mass, one in Central Mass. That I think was partly intentional and also partly convenient in that inspections occurred and everybody was ready to go. But we had worked really closely with those 2 licensees in particular, and in doing so also worked with the cities and towns that were hosting them to really brace for this is coming, it's real. We are the first state on the East Coast to go, so we have to anticipate it's not going to just be a neighborhood small retail store. This is going to be an event, and really bracing for that. All in all, we were very fortunate. Things went really smoothly. Our licensees were really cooperative. The cities and towns were really engaged. We also required 3 days advance notice prior to opening, which did give folks a heads up that this is coming. The other important part of that 3-day notice, though, for us was these were co-located facilities that were also serving patients. And the last thing we wanted was to impede patient access to these facilities. So that served as a bit of a warning notice to patients. If you need medicine, please get there within the next 3 days. You have an advance heads up that this is coming. We do still require patient priority in the facility itself. There's 2 separate lines. If a patient does want to use a patient-only line, they can use that. But I think we just wanted to make sure that they weren't really rolled up into this event, and again, their access to medicine was impeded in any way. The biggest takeaway from opening day was traffic. And I think that was the biggest news takeaway as well, was that there was so much traffic. There's a few factors to that. One, it was the week of Thanksgiving. And I think you have to keep in mind that a lot of people were home in Massachusetts and roads are generally busy. There was also a Walmart that had just opened up the street. I think it might have been the same day as Black Friday or right around that window, obviously with it being the week of Thanksgiving. I can't say that we are the only source of traffic. But again, if traffic is the biggest concern out of opening day, I think that overall means it went pretty swimmingly and a lot to be pleased with. One of the things that we were doing back at the office was we still had a licensing pipeline to take care of. We didn't want there to be only 2 stores for a prolonged period of time. So at that point, we had to think about another 60 or so provisional licenses that we were hard at work with those licensees, getting them ready to go as well to relieve some of that traffic pressure. But again, overall, the biggest takeaway was there were too many vehicles. I'd say we did pretty well.
Erik, why don't you set the stage for us about what Friday will look like as far as the number of licensed retailers, like thinking publicly facing businesses that consumers can hit. And if I'm assuming you've had a pretty close contact with them, what consumers might be able to expect based on what you know.
Yeah, so I think come Friday, we'll have either 6 or 7 stores that are open to the public, which I'm quite pleased with, considering, Maine has the unique distinction of being the only state to launch its adult use program during a global health pandemic, right? So a lot of the initial concerns I may have had in a pre-COVID world are most certainly still there, but really my main focus is that October 9th and the opening weekend comes and goes as safely as possible. So when we decided to start the system, we knew that it was going to be a slower rollout than originally anticipated. We knew that there would be limited access and limited product in the early days, just considering everything looks significantly different post-COVID. But if we wanted it to look the way that we originally wanted to, if we had a spring launch, no one really knew what that timeline would look like. That might be waiting until summer of 2022. So again, we decided this approach, realizing and knowing that there's the possibility of limited access and limited product. But the fact that we're going to have 6 or 7 stores open to the public all across the state of Maine, and we know that they are going to have product, even though it might not have every single product that a consumer might see on store shelves a year from now, I'm quite pleased. And much like Shawn pointed out, our licensees have been fantastic to work with. What we're hoping for and what we're looking for is interest, a successful day for the industry, obviously. But again, for it to come and go as safely as possible. I mean, we've gone above and beyond to make sure that we can get through this weekend without incident. We've worked with multiple state agencies on providing COVID-specific protocols for all license types, not just the public-facing ones. Guidance for retail sales. We've facilitated conversations between our licensees and local law enforcement, help ensure that there are social distancing, proper PPE. If there's large crowds or whatever that proves a potential health issue, that they know who to call. But all things considered, I am thrilled, and I know our licensees are really excited for this first weekend. So fingers crossed that everything goes off without any issue.
I want to ask specifically about product shortages. We're hearing from retailers that they expect to sell out quickly and don't know when they'll be able to restock, given the lag time between when grow licenses were approved and the opening. Understanding that there's the ability to transfer medical plants in. Can you address that issue specifically about, if you're looking at this from a complete layman's point of view, 4 years, why are we going to have a shortage of product? We should have had plenty of time to grow as much weed as possible. Can you just address that from a bird's eye view?
Right. So, I mean, the 4-week turnaround time, 4.5 weeks between when we issued our first batch of active licenses and the retail sales launch. I mean, we obviously got stakeholder input on what that turnaround time should look like. And we got a wide array of answers, whether it was like 2 weeks, we can do it, or 6 months, which didn't really make much sense. So really, it's up to the business, right? I feel like at this point, our job was to remove all the barriers to launch, put out dates that they could plan off of, and then that they were able to do what's best for their business, understanding that there were going to be some product shortages. But we do have enough, I believe we do have enough cultivators that were actively licensed and in the pipeline, that over the coming weeks and months, it should hopefully take care of itself. But yeah, I would expect that there will be, and really how the businesses themselves want to handle that, whether they open or they wait to open, or if they set purchasing limits or not, that's really a business decision for them to make. We really just wanted to present them with an opportunity to go.
So let's talk money for a minute here. Talk about the tax revenues and the taxes levied. I know consumers will be really interested in that. If you could lay out a little bit about what the tax rates are in your states. And then Erik, if you could walk me through the taxes that are going to be built into what people can buy on Friday.
Sure.
Let's stay with Cindy first.
In Alaska, marijuana is taxed only at the cultivation level. We don't have a sales tax in the state of Alaska, and there was, we do have a few items, rental cars and such, that have specific taxes attached, but there was a desire not to attach a retail level tax to marijuana. So only the cultivator pays a tax when the marijuana is transferred. When the ballot measure was written, the tax was named as a specific amount per ounce, but the ballot measure also contained a provision that once the market was created and adjusted, that the regulations could be adjusted without requiring a statutory amendment to get the taxes at a better place. taxes are something that Alaska struggles with right now. Our taxes are too high, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact rate that they are, but I call it too high, and they need to come down still because it is a significant barrier for cultivation facilities. What we're really finding up here is that the most successful businesses are the ones that are stacking retail store licenses on their cultivation facilities. And if you're a cultivator and you're just selling to retail stores that are not your own, the tax can really eat up most of your profits. So it's a work in progress up here. It's something that the board discusses often, and it is my hope now, as someone who's representing this industry, that we straighten it out soon.
So in Massachusetts, we do have a sales tax, and it's applied to cannabis sales. It's not applied to any medical sales. We treat that as medicine, which would be tax-free. But adult use is taxed with the 6.25% sales tax applied. There's also a specific excise tax at point of sale, which really operates therefore like a sales tax at 10.75%. And then any city or town that hosts a facility or retail facility is allowed to add on an additional 3% local option tax. So the effective rate is really 20%. And to my knowledge, I don't think there's any city or town that hasn't levied that 3% tax. That was actually the topic of significant legislative back and forth during the House and Senate Conference Committee of what the sweet spot tax rate should be. And we looked certainly west to see what those tax rates were, but I think also appreciated our posture as being the first state on the East Coast. Our prices are generally high compared to other jurisdictions, but I think there's a lot of factors for that. I think one is the fact that we are an island on the East Coast, but it's also an expensive production state, largely grown indoors, not the ability to grow outdoors as you would in, say, Oregon or California. And a lot of our energy and other costs are certainly high in the Northeast, but also specifically in Massachusetts. And so those are a lot of factors of the cost of just getting the good to market, so to speak. But our tax rate being 20% is something we just evaluated. We commissioned a study with KPMG to look at other alternative tax methods or structures as well as rates. And we didn't make a firm recommendation to the legislature. We don't want to step on their toes, but we think we armed them with a lot of information to make a decision if they wanted to modify it. But we'll also look to states like Maine to see where we fall to ensure that there's either some cohesiveness or maybe a competitive opportunity there. But we're at 20% today, and I don't see an appetite, at least the short term, to change that.
And actually, before we get to Erik, can you tell me what an ounce of recreational costs in your two states? Average, like not down, just so subscribers here can have a sense of what that tax actually means at the cash register.
Yeah, in Massachusetts, you're probably looking at a wholesale rate of about $4,500 to $5,000 a pound, which that's really high compared to other jurisdictions. You're probably looking at about between $15 to $20 a gram.
Okay. Cindy, I know this is a pop question, and I doubt anyone's mind.
That's okay. I did check prices for you, Penny, and on the that first day I talked about October 29th of 2016, the strains in that store were going for $18 to $22 a gram, and ironically today when I check prices in some of our online stores today, they start at about $16 a gram, and they're going all the way up to $75 a gram, depending on the strain. So we've stayed, I know there's been ups and downs through the years, but we're relatively steady at 18 to 22 a gram for what most people would want to buy.
Now, I'm not going to ask you, Erik, to predict prices for Friday, but help me walk us through the tax and this situation here in Maine.
Yeah, no, it's pretty easy and straightforward, much like Massachusetts. When the legislature put it into the MLA, they were shooting for the 20% effective rate of 20%. They did it a little bit different. They split it up into a 10% excise tax at the point of cultivation, then also a 10% sales tax. And they did that for a number of reasons. One, they didn't want the sticker shock when the consumer goes in to buy it, but also the price of marijuana fluctuates significantly in some jurisdictions, and they wanted some level of predictability of revenue, and that's why they went with the excise tax, which is unit and waste-based or count-based.
And now, for the plants that are coming in for opening day, since so many of those will be medical transfer plants, talk to me a little bit about, will they be taxed twice at the excise level?
Yep.
Opening day prices extra high.
Yep. So the legislature wrote in this one-time authorized transfer from the medical program into the adult use program. And it's only for plants, not for flower, not for trim, not for products, just plants, whether you're talking about seedlings and mature plants or mature marijuana plants. And they are taxed when they do come into the system. I believe it's 30 cents a seed, $1.50 for an immature plant. But when you're talking about the mature marijuana plants, it's $335 a pound with a conversion rate that we built into it. Understanding that's not necessarily the best way to calculate an excise tax on a marijuana plant, nor was it really in line with what I think the legislature was intended. So there is a conversion rate for that. But yes, it is taxed as it comes in, and then it is taxed as it's transferred out as well.
So just to be clear, a medical plant would be taxed at the moment when they sell that medical plant into the adult use system, and then you have to sell to an adult use grower.
Right.
And when that adult use grower transfers to a retailer, does that get taxed? Does that have another excise tax?
It does. Yep. Okay. It has the excise tax of per pound for flower and trim. Yep.
Okay. So that does mean that once you stop doing the transfers, at least the taxes built in would go down.
Yeah, you'd be paying one less excise tax, yes.
Right. Okay, just trying to prepare people for the sticker shock maybe on Friday, not to mention with limited supply, but then also with the tax issues at play. So we've had a lot of questions, I'm getting texts and chat questions and whatnot, coming in asking about who the marijuana companies are in the states. I think that some of that's focused on if these are Mainers, but also if they've got a track record of doing this safely in other places, if they've had compliance issues in other places or compliance issues in the medical side, if that's where they're coming from. Can you guys talk maybe a little bit about who your marijuana companies were at launch, and if they've stuck with it or if they've changed and maybe moved on to other markets?
Well, I'll start because we're probably a little different. We are uniquely Alaskan because of the time at which we wrote our regulations. We did write residency restrictions into the ownership. And some people may or may not know that Alaska has something that's semi-famous called the PFD, or Permanent Fund Dividend, which is essentially a dividend payment to every resident, man, woman, and child, the state of Alaska each year from our oil revenues. And in order to protect that money, there's already a substantial residence investigation system, if you will, in play so that someone doesn't come up and try to get the PFD when they're not entitled to it. So we took advantage, having the short staff that we had, of using our permanent fund dividend residency investigation system to make sure that anyone that applied for a marijuana license was also an Alaskan resident. So if you get a PFD, it's easy for the staff there at the Marijuana Control Office to check your residency. And if not, they have to conduct an independent investigation. But you have to be a resident for the full calendar year prior to applying for the license, January to December. If you applied for a license today, October 7th, you would have had to have lived in Alaska all of 2019. So our companies are Alaskan companies. They're a combination of folks who love this plant, who wanted to start businesses, who always had that dream. There are folks who are businessmen or women in other industries who have come across and are making a stab at this industry. And it's a very eclectic and unique mix. We have no license restrictions. In other words, we have no limitations on the number of licenses the board can issue, because we allow the free market to determine how many marijuana stores, for instance, we need in Alaska. And having had those stores open now for 4 years, the market is starting to do that. So we're starting to see, some stores disappear, new stores crop up. And I think the most encouraging thing about our industry and our market is that we're starting to see more cultivators take on the retail end and build vertical businesses, including product manufacturing. So we have several larger licensees that grow and do the product manufacturing, and then have the retail stores. And, those are very vital businesses that are doing very well, but they're all Alaskan.
And no one challenged that in court at the time?
No challenge to that.
Shawn, what about Massachusetts?
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, we've had an existing medical program since 2012. Really around 2014, 2015 is when it came into effect. That system is a vertically integrated licensing structure. So one license, you can cultivate, manufacture, and dispense. That system had already some multi-state operators, as well as being vertically integrated, some larger elements and businesses. So that was our early days adult use industry, and it was really a conversion to now a co-located facility. That's actually one of the reasons I think we haven't seen a supply issue just yet. That said, I should mention earlier on in our first days and weeks of adult use sales, a lot of facilities did take to rationing purchases, I think just to preserve their own independent supply. But we have those multi-state operators in our system, which doesn't really square very well with now a statutory mission that we have to get smaller businesses into this space. And it's not just Massachusetts specific, but instead it's more demographic specific around women, minority, and veteran-owned businesses, as well as farmers. We also have a really strong social equity component in our statute, where we have to first, I think, acknowledge that the war on drugs had a disproportionate impact on certain communities, including in Massachusetts, and that this new industry is going to authorize and actually provide a license for folks to conduct business and to conduct a business that folks are currently serving time in jail for, or did previously. And I think that social equity program, social justice mission that we have, standing that next to a vertically integrated multi-state operator is a bit awkward. We therefore have an economic empowerment certification program. If someone qualifies, there's certain conditions under which someone could qualify. It might be a previous conviction. It could be living within one of those areas of disproportionate impact. There's 29 we've identified across Massachusetts, as well as having a commitment to social justice, hiring people with previous convictions, etc. If you meet 3 of those 6 criteria, you cut the line in our licensing process. And especially early on, when we had a pretty lengthy queue, that was really valuable. We also have a social equity program that looks at folks from 4 different tracks, and I think acknowledges a role they can play in the industry. One is certainly licensure. I'd like to be an entrepreneur. I'd like to get into this business. Another one is a core, we call it the core track. That's for, I want to be a cultivation manager. I want to be a retail manager. I don't necessarily want the license for myself, but I do want to be in management in one of these facilities. We also have entry and re-entry, which is I just want to work in this industry. I'm curious about it. Re-entry is a returning to society component. And then last, which I think is a really interesting way to look at this industry, is an ancillary business track. I may never want to touch the plant. I may have a previous conviction in my background. Someone in my immediate family may have a conviction, but I'm now an electrician. I'm now an IT specialist, or I'm an HVAC specialist. I know this industry can be lucrative for me, but I don't want a license. I don't want to be an agent of a facility and touch the plant, but I can still do well through this industry. So we're really striving, I think, to get some smaller operators into this space. And I think first off, by acknowledging that the war on drugs did in fact have a disproportionate impact. And I think we, therefore, as a state, as a Commonwealth, have an obligation to try to do something about that when we introduce this industry. So we're standing to larger multi-state operators and smaller businesses up against not one another. I think the market can play within itself, but that is a bit of an awkward component. The last piece I would add, as far as transfers and mergers and Is Canada legalizing federally? We've seen more activity with mergers and some folks going public, which has put our staff in a position of having to evaluate some really complicated contracts and reverse mergers, et cetera. So I would say that's going to be a trend nationally that other states, including Maine at some point potentially, and we as regulators talk amongst ourselves sometimes about what is everybody doing about publicly traded companies.
Yep. And so here in Maine, we're going to see a mixed bag as well. I think the vast majority of them will be Maine owned, but we'll eventually get to the point where we see those multi-state operators come. Residency is always an interesting topic here in Maine when it comes to marijuana. So originally when the legislature wrote the Marijuana Legalization Act, they did have a Maine residency requirement. And that's how we moved forward when the Office of Marijuana Policy drafted our regulations and built out our licensing system. But we did get a challenge in court from a multi-state operator. And at the advice of our counsel, the Office of Attorney General, they had some serious constitutional concerns about the residency requirement and felt that it was very unlikely to succeed if they were to defend it. So we made the decision to no longer enforce the residency requirement and really keep our heads down and move forward with the job that we had at hand. And I think that decision was validated in two court decisions that have come down over the last couple of weeks. But I think because we had such a head start with the regulations in our licensing system and our licensing process, where most people that, well, at that point, everybody in the process, it was a Maine owned company, we're already in the pipeline. There have been some that have gone back to adjust ownership structures. But I think for the most part, you're going to see a significant skew towards those Maine-based operations while also having a home for those multi-state operators as well.
And do you know on the 7 stores authorized to open on Friday, how many of those are Maine owned? I'm not going to ask you to call them out, mostly because I don't want to play favorites and I don't want to pop quiz you, but do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I do, and I will give you an answer not knowing 100% without peeking back at it, but I believe of the 8 active licensed stores, 1 is a multi-state operator.
8. Now you mentioned 8 instead of 7. I heard that you authorized another store today, this afternoon.
We did. We issued an active license to a retail shop in Auburn.
Got it, because I know where I'm going tomorrow. So I also, I was warned we were going to run out of time pretty quickly, so I want to hop over to one other question before we start taking questions from the audience. Because Maine was a very close referendum question, it was 49.5 to 50.5 as far as the split goes. There are many people that still think that this was a terrible idea, and that's the reason why it's not approved at a lot of municipal levels here. But I wanted to see ask a little bit about what Massachusetts and Alaska has seen as far as the impacts of legalization, how you've monitored those, if there were any problems that came up, whether it be youth consumption or impaired driving spikes, the kind of things that gave people pause at the ballot box, how you're monitoring those, and if you've made any tweaks to the legislation because of it. And Erik, I'm going to ask just if you could kind of come in at the end there and talk about how Maine will be monitoring that.
Sure.
So Cindy, why don't you hit me?
I will start. One of the things we ran into very early on, because we were almost a 52-48 state, but we were on the closer sides of 52 and 48. And so there was, we did fight the first year, in addition to everything else we were doing, a repeal effort in our state legislature to repeal the ballot measure. So we were sort of fighting on all fronts. And one of the things that happened was that these ideas that you're talking about, Penny, of, impaired driving is going to go way up, how to measure that became a real issue, because what we found out is that our lack of data collection, particularly on, say, impaired driving, was really going to be an obstacle to determining the effect of the ballot measure on something like that. When our officers pulled someone over for impaired driving pre-ballot measure, they either marked that they seemed impaired from alcohol or they seemed impaired from drugs, but they never distinguished what type of drug. And so if those numbers were to go up, it's really not an apples to apples comparison. And so I believe that our Department of Public Safety basically started from scratch, monitoring those numbers in a more discrete way after the ballot measure passed. And they're just simply keeping track of those, from that point forward, because a comparison really could not be effectively done. And we learned a lot about data collection through working through some of those issues. Overall, Alaska was a state that was extremely pro-marijuana, pro-individual rights prior to legalization. I think I mentioned to you, Penny, that we have a 1975 Supreme Court case that permitted every Alaskan to grow marijuana in their own home, starting in 1975. And so the general reaction to the passage of the marijuana ballot measure and the stores has been, see, this isn't any big deal, and we knew that it wouldn't be.
Right.
So we had a ballot question that was relatively close. It seems like it was actually a little bit more popular than perhaps Alaska and Maine, but there are still many skeptics just the same. And as a result, I do feel a level of accountability to those folks as far as making sure we are implementing in a safe, efficient, and effective way, because this is something that folks are scrutinizing and something that we will be scrutinized for. And I think we've intentionally built a lot of our infrastructure with that in mind. So we collect a lot of data. We know we're collecting a lot of data. We publish it through an open data platform. We also conduct a lot of research that the legislature had asked us to, but now we're collecting it and presenting it in a way that we want folks to reach conclusions on their own as opposed to just taking our word for it. It would be really easy for me to stand here today or sit here today and say, looking at how we performed, I deem it a success. Well, of course I do. I worked really hard at it. But I want to give folks the opportunity, unvarnished and pure, to say, based on the data that Massachusetts is publishing, reach your own conclusions and hold us accountable, and we're willing to be held accountable. On a number of the things you mentioned, we've really tried to collect data and prove what we don't know, which is impaired driving is certainly a concern of many people. I had the opportunity to chair a special commission to evaluate what we could do in Massachusetts specifically around impaired driving. It included folks like the ACLU and the NAACP, as well as our District Attorneys Association and the Mass Chiefs of Police, and folks that from the Defense Bar, as well as our Department of Public Health and someone with an expertise in lab testing. So it was a really broad panel. And of course, there was no one conclusion as to what we should do about it. And it was for a lot of the same reasons. It's tough to actually detect impairment on the roadside. And the measures to actually determine impairment are really invasive. We're not going to allow roadside blood draws to check the level of THC in your system. And there is no breathalyzer equivalent. At the same time, we did recommend some things that might be modified components of statute, and the legislature is still chewing on those things. We do have a full-time legislature. We also had the benefit of our Department of Public Health conducting a baseline study. And what they did is they looked at youth access, they looked at arrest rates. We now inherited that study. It's our obligation to take the baton and continue it, to actually look at the impacts of legalization. And the last piece I'll add is we added, as part of our budget, as well as some of our rollout, a public awareness campaign. And that was really an intentional component, that the language of it, the tone of it, I give our staff a lot of credit for being very real about, this is legalization, this is what to expect, we're adults, be responsible. And so it's not the tone of, this is your brain on drugs, don't do it. Instead, it's saying, we voted for this. We as Massachusetts voted for this. So it's more about MJ, or more about marijuana, more about MJ is I think the website. And it's really, I think, well, again, I'll sit here and declare victory. I think it's really well done. But obviously, again, reach your own conclusions. The impact is definitely something that we're still going to monitor. I think we have decent tools to monitor it, and every intention of trying to.
But have you seen increases in those issues so far, or is it still too early to say?
Yeah, I think it's really early to say. The same thing that Cindy pointed out on the OUI in particular was it's OUI drugs, school suspension for drugs. We also, and one of my commissioners would scold me if I didn't mention this. We're working on a product database right now, or a product catalog, where folks like school principals and school resource officers and even parents can go into this database and say, is this a product from the legal market? And we want to be a good partner to law enforcement, a good partner for school resource officers and schools in general and parents in general, as well as the public health community. We saw just last week, one of our local hospital systems put out a press release saying that they're seeing a lot of emergency room visits from children. We looked at it, and one of the products they were referring to could not have possibly been from the legal marketplace, just based on the dosage alone. And so that we looked at that as not a referendum on legalization, but instead an opportunity to engage healthcare even further and say, we should put our heads together on this, because your conclusion's a bit misplaced, but secondly, we could use your expertise and your voice in this, and certainly your credibility. So I'd say too early to determine overall, but again, I think we've got some mechanisms in place to hold ourselves accountable.
All right.
I don't know how I'm supposed to answer this, Penny, and not go over 8 o'clock. This is like one of my favorite topics to talk about. But
Yeah,
I think
because we have some reader questions I want to get.
I'll do my best. I think first and foremost, I mean, in Maine, I think the referendum vote was decided by a couple thousand votes. And I think first and foremost, as regulators, for us to be effective and do our job, it's imperative that we remain neutral in everything we do around legalization, because you need to engage every single stakeholder from both ends of the spectrum in order to make the program the best program possible, no matter what state you're in. So we've really had that mindset as we've done our work. And also, as far as public health and safety, that's really what drives our decision making in the office when it comes to really any decision that we're making, so much so that it's in our mission statement that we put together the first week Office of Marijuana Policy was founded. But as far as understanding the impact of these legal markets on our state, this has been a project that I like to talk about a lot. I mean, they're consistent across jurisdictions, whether you're talking about impaired driving, youth use, emergency room visits, labor issues. So we've really indicated a lot of the questions that we want answered, and have started building out our data lake and data warehouse, whereas we can really make data-driven decisions about program improvements and find answers to some of the questions that people may have. Really what we're trying to do is take data from our licensing system and data from our inventory tracking system and layering it with that public health and safety data, so you can really hone in on what actually might be the cause and effect of issues that we do see, not only statewide, but down to county and municipal levels. So very excited about that project. We're facing the same challenges Massachusetts and Alaska have about getting your hands on the right data. And if it's not there, then figuring out how to gather it, whether it costs money or whether it entails going to the legislature to get some adjustments. But we're in that data discovery phase. We've engaged probably 7 or 8 different state agencies, public health coalitions across the state. So very exciting project. And again, much like everything else we do, we're going to try to be as transparent as possible, have public dashboards specific to public health, safety, labor, whatever it may be, much in the same way we try to do with our applicants and licensees on our dashboard on our website.
I'm glad that's going to all be public so I can get my hands on it. So I'm going to switch over to questions and try and get as many of these in as I can. I have a question here from John McNeil, who wants to know how much the regulated market has affected the illegal market. And this was specifically for Alaska, but I'm going to ask of all, no offense, John, but for all 3 states, do you have a sense of whether, Cindy and Shawn, if this has done anything to starve the illegal market in your states?
For Alaska, not as much as we hoped. And part of that is tied to that high cultivation tax rate. And, some of the other obstacles to, it's hard to get a license. And then once you get it, it's hard to run one of these businesses. And one of the effects of our long-standing home grows is that we had a very robust black market marijuana market. We just did. And so making inroads into that is difficult. What I will say is I've been most impressed by people really wanting, from both sides, people who used to sell illegally really wanting to become legal, and people who used to buy from someone that didn't have a license wanting to buy from licensed in the licensed market. So it typically, because we don't have medical in Alaska, the folks that are still using the black market are those that are using medical doses, essentially, because, you know, we have all of our edibles and products in stores kind of ratcheted down to tourist level, if you will. And if you've ever seen an Alaska tourist, I mean, it's a pretty novice level of use. And so I think that what's really driving our black market right now are folks that just need a lot higher dosages, and our adult use market does not accommodate that. So those are future problems for our state.
Yeah, the illicit market is still alive in Massachusetts, as it is in most legal jurisdictions. I think a number of reasons for that is we're now introducing a delivery license type. In fact, we're hoping tomorrow will be the first time the commission issues a provisional license for a delivery operator. That, I think, is an access question. And then, as we talked about earlier, our price is really high, and especially compared to what the illicit market can offer. The price of bringing that product to market, so the infrastructure and everything that goes along with it, as well as just the competitive marketplace itself. So our goal is ultimately not to just eradicate and eliminate the illicit market. It's really to migrate operators that have an intention of getting into the legal space and giving them the pipeline. So we're trying to build infrastructure to bring, to create that pipeline, including the programming and technical assistance and everything else that we talked about earlier too. But I would say that we're early days in that exercise, and again, really good intentions, a lot of work to be done, but we're not there yet.
And I'm going to ask actually one question of you, Erik, here at the very end, as far as we had a couple questions coming in about medical here, and that kind of tags onto what Cindy had said. How is this going to impact the medical market here in Maine, and will you maintain the separate tax structure for medical and recreational?
Yes. So the short answer is they're going to remain to be two marijuana programs that our office runs that are on parallel tracks to each other. It's to be determined, right? We have a fairly robust medical program that have these small growers that are very proud of their product, much like microbrews in the state of Maine. But much like every other jurisdiction that's legalized adult use, I think the vast majority of the public really just want to access marijuana products on Main Street. So I fully expect the medical program to go down in size, but maybe not as drastically as we've seen in other states, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And we totally plan to work moving forward with both the registrants of the medical program and the adult use program to make sure that they're both working the best way possible for the state of Maine, for the patients on the medical side and the consumers on the adult use side.
There's so many other questions I wanted to ask, but we are running out of time. We were out of time, actually. Thank you so much to all of you for coming and tuning into this. So your questions that you entered into the Q&A are going to be saved, and I'm going to follow up on those in separate stories whenever I possibly can. But Cindy, Shawn, Erik, thank you so much for doing this with us. I really appreciate it. And I am going to use the last second here to make a plug for something else, which is that these subscriber events that we're doing, I wanted to let people know that you can register now for next week's Newsroom Live event, which is a totally different topic, a rocked music scene from Bob Keys and Amesel Ponte. It's going to be Wednesday, October 14th at 7 o'clock. We hope that you can join us there. Thanks everybody for coming.